Welcome back to Season 5 of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm happy to go on this journey with you. After more than a year of fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, which has displaced thousands on both sides of the border, President Biden announced that a Lebanon-Israeli ceasefire was approved by the Israeli cabinet, and at the time of this taping is expected to be approved by the Lebanese cabinet as well. In his speech, Prime Minister Netanyahu outlined three key reasons for his decision to go for its ceasefire. 1. Prioritizing the Iranian threat against Israel. 2. Giving Israeli forces time to regroup and replenish. And 3. Delinking the different fronts between Lebanon and Gaza. However, Netanyahu emphasized that the duration of the ceasefire will be dependent upon developments on the ground in Lebanon. This is potentially a watershed moment since October 7th of last year. Now there's a real possibility, for the first time since then, that the conflict in the north with Hezbollah could be decoupled from the ongoing conflict in Gaza. How did this ceasefire come to be? And how does it compare to the end of the 2006 war in Lebanon? What are the roles of outside players like the US and Iran? And how might this moment represent a shift in the Iranian calculus? To help us understand these important dynamics, I'm joined today by Amos Harel, a leading and senior military analyst for Haaretz, who has written extensively on Israel's northern front, Israel's military writ large, and is a keen observer of Israel's security leadership. Amos, welcome back to Decision Points.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me.
So look, these are momentous times. The ceasefire that has been announced by President Biden. I'd like to just ask your view about why did Israel agree to this ceasefire, and maybe if you could separate out the military establishment that you know so well, and maybe also the Prime Minister. What do you see as the motivations for accepting the ceasefire with Lebanon at this time?
I don't think there's one simple answer for that. It could be a combination of a few reasons and trends. When it comes to the military, I would assume that their thinking is that they've achieved enough or close to enough. And if they stay longer in southern Lebanon while fighting, this could get more messy and more complicated. And on top of everything else, they're facing a huge problem regarding force attrition. Both the reservists and the regular army have been fighting for more than a year. Not a lot of people carrying a huge burden, and this has become more and more of a problem. If the war continues on both fronts, on Gaza and Lebanon, this may be too much, and there may be more complications to the situation. When it comes to Benjamin Netanyahu's decisions, we know that this is not the old Netanyahu, the person we knew for so many years. He's struggling for his personal survival, facing criminal accusations, on trial, about to bear testimony within a week. And it's a very difficult situation for him. And then we've had the latest development, the decision in Hague, the arrest warrants against the ICC, against both him and former Defense Minister Gallant. And it's now been announced that France has publicly supported the Israeli position against the ICC decision. So this could have been a motive for Netanyahu as well. And then you have the political situations, the political situation back home. Netanyahu needs to survive politically. He needs to maneuver between the ultra-Orthodox parties who keep applying pressure in order for him to pass the law which would finally exempt their voters from military service. This is on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have the extreme right-wingers whose voters are actually taking a huge share of the burden, of the military burden, and also the losses in fighting in Lebanon. So you have two different parts of the coalition working against each other. One way of solving that is at least by limiting the number of arenas in which the IDF fights. If the war in Lebanon ends, this means that you can probably send home tens of thousands of miluimniks, of reserve soldiers. That would ease some of the political pressure tearing the government from within. So for all of these different reasons, and I think there are quite a lot more, it is probably the best thing in Netanyahu's view to go for a ceasefire, in spite of the fact that this is incomplete, that there are many reservations about the agreement itself, and that there's always the possibility that the arrangement could collapse and lead to the war being resumed.
It's interesting that this is a rare moment in time that Netanyahu seems to be going against his base, seems to have been an article of faith for him. Don't go against the base. I hear this always from people around him, but this is not a popular ceasefire with mayors in the north. I've seen other snap polls. Why is this ceasefire unpopular? Because in Washington, what it looks like is there's a gap of expectations that the Israeli public thought that the U.S. is going to enforce a ceasefire. That implied maybe boots on the ground, but that was really not a possibility. And we're going to talk about this mechanism to adjudicate violations that is going to be chaired by the U.S. And I think some of the Israelis thought there would be a buffer zone in southern Lebanon. But it's just striking to me about the expectations of people, not just in the north, but otherwise. And you could understand them because this does not seem to be a total victory. I know Netanyahu says he talks about total victory when it comes to Gaza, not when it comes to the north. But so far, this does not seem to be popular at this time, and yet he went forward. And so I'm just wonder if you could speak to that about why this ceasefire right now is unpopular. Or maybe you could say, David, it's unpopular now because people see the faults, but they'll like it over time because they want to return to quiet.
So, in a sense, I think Netanyahu might be a victim of his own spin machine right now. It's Netanyahu and his followers and his spokespeople who created these high expectations. And he did talk of decisive victory, or at least his followers did a few weeks back. And people were expecting, people who support him, and especially people who support him and happen to live in the north in places that were evacuated a year ago, expected him to deliver a decisive victory over Hezbollah. And it turns out, as always, that there are limits to Israel's military power, and that the strategic situation in the region is, of course, much more complicated than people assume. There are so many variables here, and it's very, very hard to reach a final deal. It was pretty obvious for quite some time that Hezbollah was hit extremely badly and that it urgently needed a way out, and that it was even willing to disconnect from Gaza. Remember Nasrallah speaking and saying time after time again that he would never surrender, that he would never stop fighting as long as Gaza is involved in fighting against Israel. And yet, 2 months after he was assassinated by the Israelis, here we are, and Hezbollah has signed an agreement, which in a way it has signed its own surrender regarding this aspect, at least. And what you can see now, which is interesting to the point of being ironic, is Netanyahu's followers being torn over that. If you listen carefully or watch carefully, Channel 14, which is somewhere between Fox and Newsmax, if I can make the comparison to American politics, you can see his mouthpieces torn apart over this. Some are saying this is Bibi, he can't be wrong. We should do everything he says, and we'll see in time, we'll see his great wisdom being proven again. While others are saying, no, 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 this is not what we expected. He promised us more. And there are some voices on the right as well. Since Netanyahu is a very good politician, this is the reason why he avoided any kind of vote of confidence at the Knesset around this. Even the Israeli government didn't vote on the draft of the agreement. That's the cabinet.
The security cabinet did, but not the overall cabinet.
Yeah, and the security cabinet voted by 10 votes against one, and that was Itamar Ben-Gvir. And it was quite clear that Ben-Gvir, who leads the most extreme party in government, would never support the deal. Ben-Gvir applied the same trick a year ago at the first hostage deal, you may recall. He voted against it, and yet he didn't resign over this from the coalition. So this is perfectly well from Netanyahu. In the long run, it's problematic for him because of the reasons we've mentioned, because his voters, especially people in the north, may get angry over this and may feel disappointed when they compare between his promises and the actual reality. And yet, I remain, for the time being, relatively optimistic about the outcome here because I still think Hezbollah was hit very, very badly. And like you, I remember the past, 2006, the end of Lebanon 2, of the second Lebanon war. And at that time, again, Hezbollah was celebrating. There's an anecdote you tell, and that we retold it in our book, Avi Sachal and myself, about the second Lebanon war, where they were celebrating a great victory in Beirut, while it was clear that there was no victory achieved. This time, I think Israel's achievements are much higher than 2006. And yet, okay, the other side, being Hezbollah being what it is and Lebanon being what it is, will keep on celebrating, while the reality is quite far from that.
So before I get into the achievements as you see it, but I just, in terms of the way the military sees the motivations for a ceasefire, how much of it was, in your view, look, every marginal day does not yield that much more results, versus what Netanyahu alluded to in his remarks about also the need for resupply? Is there a feeling that, and the administration has gone on publicly to deny that they threaten, not to veto Security Council resolutions. But Netanyahu raised the idea of rearmament, of chimushim, of ammunition, and the like. To what extent was that, do you think, for the military people, was that a factor, or that was not so central?
So I'll make the distinction between the two arguments being made. Netanyahu talks of a possible embargo or de facto embargo by the Biden administration, and people around him also mentioned the possibility of Biden acting like Obama in 2016 and refusing to veto anti-Israeli decisions at the Security Council and the UN. I'm not sure that this is the case. I don't think that this is what they're really concerned about. Netanyahu, as we said, had his own reasons, while the army is worried about the war becoming the forever war, fighting two long wars that never end, paying more and more with casualties and with resources and so on, and not being able to reach a decisive victory. What I keep hearing from the generals, and I've talked to most of the top brass during the last month or so, is that this needs to get to be over with. We need to finish this matter once and for all. We need to reach an agreement. In Lebanon, Hezbollah has been more or less defeated for the time being, not forever, but this is enough for us to reach a high level of deterrence for quite some time. We should work for the new agreement to be better than 1701, the resolution reached in 2006, in order to make sure that Hezbollah isn't able to bypass the international surveillance. This time, we should insist that we have the power to strike at Hezbollah if it misbehaves under the new conditions, and yet we need to stop fighting. And then, of course, there's a similar discussion over Gaza, because the IDF keeps saying for a long time, not only the IDF, but also Shin Bet and Mossad chiefs are saying the same thing. Yes, there could be a hostage deal in Gaza. Yes, we need to make important, costly concessions, but this is the way out. We need to get the hostages back, because otherwise there's a huge psychological scar to the Israeli public if it doesn't get solved. And if we clear Lebanon out of the way, at least for the time being, then there's room for more maneuvering in Gaza, whether it's applying more military pressure or having more leeway in negotiations in order to solve the Gaza hostages problem as much as we can. And look, yesterday evening, the IDF spokesperson released photographs of the Golani Brigade, the commander in the Golani Brigade, crossing the Litani River. In fact, this picture was taken 5 or 6 days ago. And the message is loud and clear. This is the same river that the IDF had a huge problem crossing in 2006. The last battle was the Saluki battle, which is a part of the Litani River in 2006. It's quite a traumatic experience. The message is loud and clear. We're doing better this time. We achieved things that we haven't achieved before. And yet, I think for most Israelis, this issue, this long looming tragedy of October 7th will not be solved as long as the Gaza issue isn't solved, and as long as the hostages and the bodies of more hostages are being brought back. And Netanyahu himself, of course, doesn't share the sentiment. He hardly speaks emotionally about the price, the psychological, huge price being paid by hostages' families and by the Israeli society at large. And he doesn't seem to be very interested in pushing this idea forward. But here is where he is different than most of the top brass. The people leading the security organizations think very, very differently about this whole matter.
It's fascinating listening to you, because listening to you about where the military establishment is very much similar to where, in the United States, where I think the administration is at. I mean, the older thinking was do a deal in Gaza, and this will shut down the North, and then that will be able to off ramp it to the Gulf. I mean, now it seems clear in the U.S., since the killing of the six in the tunnel, the six hostages in the tunnel in the summer, that the U.S. thinking, and then Israel went into Lebanon, that the U.S. certainly flipped the script, as we say, and said, no, if you can get a deal in the north, this will decouple the north from Hamas. Hamas will be isolated, and they'll be more likely to do a hostage deal. It's just fascinating, that the prime minister, didn't really focus on that as much, like the way the U.S. does, and then the way that the military establishment does as well. But look, you're a senior military analyst, and everyone's going to write a piece saying, compare this to 2006. The prime minister says, look, we've set back Hezbollah decades. Everyone knows the story of the pagers. It's out of like a Netflix movie. The decapitation of the senior command led by, Nasrallah himself. Do you think the military sees Hezbollah really as a shadow of its former self? Yes, it has rockets, but this did not end in a standoff. I remember 34 days in 2006. You and I remember this very well. It seemed like it was a draw to the last day. How do you compare this to 2006? And has Hezbollah really been set back decades?
I think it's different. I think it's better from an Israeli perspective in 2006. It's also much better than whatever happened on the Hamas front in Gaza last year. The difference, of course, is that Hamas managed to surprise us completely with this horrific attack on October 7th, 23, while in Lebanon, mostly it was Israel calling the shots. It was Israel which decided to escalate. And Nasrallah, I think, had a very mistaken view of the way the war was handled. He kept talking in terms of equations. Remember the famous equations in 2006, Bada Bada, Haifa, and so on, after Haifa, meaning striking south of Haifa in return for Israeli attacks in the Dahya, in southern Beirut. And he kept holding to these equations until the minute he died. This was the reality. He didn't really understand that this was a different Israel, and that in fact, for a few weeks, he was already engulfed in a full-scale war. He kept thinking that if he only struck Tel Aviv with a few rockets, then Israel would take a step back. You've mentioned some of the acts taken by the Israelis, but this is not the whole story. We assume that 70 or 80% of Hezbollah's firepower was actually destroyed by Israel during the same months. And I went twice with the army inside to military incursions into southern Lebanon. And what you could see there is the IDF in full control of Shiite villages, Hezbollah evacuating completely outside of the area, and massive Israeli successes. There were losses, of course. There are more than 70 soldiers killed during this period. But when you compare that to the scenarios that the IDF considered before the war, this is very, very different. We were preparing for 3,000 rockets a day. We were preparing for a possible period of darkness in Tel Aviv area, or perhaps most of the country, because Hezbollah would hit our power stations. This didn't actually happen. The most Hezbollah could do, because of the shock it has suffered, because so much of its command and control networks were taken out very early, the most they could launch were about 300 rockets a few days ago. And yes, there was a day in which the Sharon area, in which I happen to live, slightly north of Tel Aviv, there were 3 sirens during 24 hours. But so what? In the eyes of most Israelis, this isn't a huge price to pay. A much more massive price was paid in the south, in the Gaza envelope, since the beginning of the war. And yes, people in the northern third of the country are suffering for a long time. Everyday life is more or less stopped. It's hard to go to work. It's hard to go to school. But this is over with since this morning. If it weren't for the mess that has been left behind in Gaza, people would probably have felt rather good about themselves this morning. The problem is that Gaza goes on. But I think you can say that 2006 and 2024 are on the same level, because the IDF actually has learned its lessons from 2006. It's prepared better. It had better intelligence. It had massive operations with Mossad and Shin Bet, which were sent forward at the right moment. And all of this meant a massive advantage over Hezbollah, perhaps not a final victory. There's no flag on Iwo Jima scenario, and nobody has said the Reichstag has surrendered. But the Lebanese and Hezbollah's decision to go forward with an agreement, which meant disconnecting completely from Gaza, I think this is significant. It tells you that both Hezbollah and especially their Iranian minders have decided that the price was too high, that if they want to survive, they want to maintain some kind of capability regarding Hezbollah, they needed to stop now. Now, I can't talk of decades. I think it would probably take less. Iran is very good at resupplying different proxy forces. War could break out in a few months or maybe in a few years. And yet, if we ended with, after a miserable draw in 2006, we had 17 years of quiet, I think that there's a possibility, a good possibility here, that we'll receive some calm for quite a long time, considering everything that the IDF has achieved.
On that point about Iran, certainly on the American side, I think there's a sense that this deal would not have happened unless Iran greenlighted it. And the more that the Hezbollah top leadership was decimated, decapitated at the top, the more influence Iran has. After all, Hezbollah is a proxy anyway of Iran to begin with. So, how do you think the Israeli intel world and the like, how do they read Iran's decision to, if that is correct, to, prioritize maybe relations with the new Trump administration and urge a ceasefire? Do they think really Hezbollah had no choice given its military setbacks?
It's a combination of two things that you've mentioned. One is that Hezbollah has suffered a significant blow and that it needs time and energy to begin to recover. And look, most of Hezbollah's most talented terrorist commanders, political leaders, are out of the way. It's not only Nasrallah, it's Haj Muhsin Fuad Shukr, who was their chief of staff of the military wing. It's Ali Karki and Ibrahim Akil, longtime leaders in their early 60s, people who fought Israel for close to 40 years. All of these people were taken out. So it will take time. It will need much. There will need to be much more involvement by the IRGC, by the Iranians, in order to help Hezbollah begin to recover from this situation. And then there's the larger picture, which has to do with what you mentioned briefly, which is Iran's role in the region and Iran's policies. Hezbollah is just part of this picture. It's a very important proxy force, but it's not where Iranian calculations begin and end. There's more to this than only Hezbollah. Of course, there's a question of the relationship with the United States and especially the arrival of Donald Trump. One thing we know about the Iranians and Trump is that the Iranians fear Trump, that they see him as somebody who's very, very hard to understand. And it's very, very hard for them, like many other forces in the world, to estimate in advance where Trump is heading. He's a mystery wrapped in an enigma. So for them, the main priority right now is to reach some kind of an agreement with the new administration, perhaps allow the new administration, convince them to lift some of the sanctions, which are very damaging to the Iranian economy, in return for slowing down or stopping the Iranian nuclear project. All of this, of course, is not simple. But if the war goes on and if an Iranian proxy force keeps on launching rockets at Israel, and this is against American interests, this is not a way forward. This is not starting the new relationship with the administration from an optimistic point of view. So if they need to make those concessions, of course, I'm generalizing and simplifying here. But my assumption is that if the Iranians are now calculating what their strategy forward should be, they're probably saying, let's slow down on Lebanon in order for us to get what is most necessary for us, which is some kind of an agreement with the Trump administration.
Okay, so now I just have this really just three quick themes that I want to touch on going forward. One is a mindset question, which is the preference in the military since 2006 was maintain the quiet. There was a kind of mutual deterrence, you could even say. But in that period, Hezbollah was digging tunnels, rearming, and the like. This is going to require a view that says you may need to engage militarily, even if it's quiet, if indeed, that they are digging tunnels, rearming. And that's hard in a democracy to go to a war, or, when there's not a clear military provocation of an actual attack. So I'm just wondering, the military so well in Israel, this idea of what they call not being addicted to quiet, being willing to act quicker if you see even signs of rearmament. How is the army going to adapt to that kind of mindset in your view?
So I was about to use the exact same term, addicted to quiet, because I heard an interview given by Efi Eitam, a former minister and former general, who's one of Netanyahu's closest informal advisors. And this is what he said yesterday in a radio interview. He said we should not get addicted again to calm. This has been happening for too many years, and this is the reason why we are, why we're stuck in this war right now. I'm paraphrasing, but this was more or less the message. As usual, with people around Netanyahu, we didn't mention the fact that Netanyahu was in charge for most of these 18 years. So he's mostly blaming the army. The reality is that Netanyahu and different governments under Olmert and later under Lapid and Bennett were all sharing more or less the same view over both Gaza and Lebanon. And this was the top priority was always keeping the calm. It was always the question of would hotels in Nahariya and Metula, two towns close to the border in Lebanon, keep having guests, or will we take a risk and strike in Lebanon while we know that this could mean a massive amounts of rockets being launched, at least at the northern part of Israel. And time again, the Israeli decision was to wait and not to act. Later on, especially under Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot as chiefs of staff of the army, Israel did push forward, but this is what they called the Mabam, the war between wars. And the strikes were only pointed at convoys that were smuggling weapons from outside of Lebanon, in Syria, for instance, and this is where they hit them. But Lebanon remained a sort of a safe space in which Israel did not dare to act. I think one of the conclusions from last year is that Israel needs to be more aggressive, more proactive, and if necessary, strike even at sites inside Lebanon if it knows that Hezbollah is either preparing for an attack of its own or acquiring more weapons and ammunition. It will be difficult to send that message to the region and also to persuade the Israeli public. But yet, I think after October 7th and after the terrible year we went through, I think more Israelis would be convinced that a proactive policy should be taken on both fronts.
That brings me to the second point, which is look, an innovation of this ceasefire is that the United States will chair a panel that is intended to adjudicate violations. And while this panel existed after 2006 and emerged from 1701, even though I don't think it was in it, this tripartite of UNIFIL and the Lebanese armed forces and Israel meeting in Nakura in southern Lebanon, how will this panel work? What is Israel's expectation on violations? Will Israel bring a violation to maybe it's CENTCOM, the Central Command, who Israel has excellent relations with the U.S. Military Command for the Middle East, and say, here, there's a violation. And what happens? You give it a week to address it, and then they go to the Lebanese armed forces, and then they investigate. What is Israel's expectation of this panel? What will it actually achieve? Or will this make it harder for Israel to address violations? Because in a week, you could hide things in a way that you couldn't do it if you acted immediately. What is the expectations on the Israeli side, do you feel?
Look, David, I'm not evading the question, but I think it's too soon to tell. We just don't know yet what the rules of engagement are going to be regarding all of this. And I'm not sure that perhaps Amos Harel knows, perhaps there are all kinds of agreements or tacit understandings with Ron Dermer and Benjamin Netanyahu. Right now, I think the army, at least, is especially happy about the referee, about the fact that it's the US that's going to take these calls and make those decisions. Because, as you've said, in the 90s, the US played a part, but it was always with the UN and France and other international forces. And France was readmitted into the big boys' room, so to speak, yesterday because of what we mentioned earlier regarding Haag. But other than that, it is the US that is about to lead the way. And it also has to do with this very close relationship that you mentioned between the IDF's top brass and General Kurilla.
Who's the head of CENTCOM, just for our listeners?
Yeah, so the Israelis are very happy about that. And I think this is being presented as one of the great advantages of the new agreement. See, the United States is here. It's not going to desert us. They're going to support us. They're going to understand our cause. And perhaps, okay, they will be perhaps an objective mediator, but at least they understand our situation. Unlike the international community and especially the UN. And as you know, there's a lot of resentment in Israel, including the IDF, regarding the UN's performance at large, and specifically UNIFIL's capability for more than 40 years. So this is indeed considered an improvement, although we're not aware of the full details yet. I think they'll work it out as they proceed, but it is a positive step, or at least a positive sign forward.
My last question is getting people back to their homes in the north, and a lot of listeners want to know this. Given the displacement, they also care about the Lebanese too, about their ability to return to their homes. Given the reaction of the mayors and the like against the agreement, who feel it's inadequate, and you could say it's a function of unrealistic expectations and not understanding all the variables of a complex regional situation, whatever the reasons for that, what is it going to take to bring people back? Can the North be restored to what it was? Is it going to be different? What are the variables? And I'm sure the defense establishment cares a lot about this. These are people who live there themselves. They see themselves as acting on behalf of Israeli society. And for much of the Israeli people, this is what they determine as success. Can the people go back to their homes in the north, as they say in Hebrew, bevitra, with the sense of security that they will be safe? What's it going to take?
So these are exactly the two major criteria. One is security, and the other is economy. Security, people will come back gradually if they're persuaded that life is going back to normal. It doesn't mean that they won't fear a surprise escalation at one point in which rockets are launched, or even more damaging and frightening, of course, a new October 7th in the north, although it will be harder to do because now most of Hezbollah's positions and resources and infrastructure have been wiped out by the IDF, at least to up to 10 kilometers north of the border. So people will be weary of coming back, considering the damages, considering what has happened. And it will take a lot of convincing from the government and the IDF. And the IDF, for instance, will need to make people sure that no longer will it only deploy 3 or 4 battalions there. There will be massive forces deployed for a long time, including reservists, in order to make people feel protected. It's not about only about protection itself, it's about a sense of protection, about a sense of security. It's always the combination of the two. And people, of course, have lost trust in the IDF, considering everything has happened, especially October 7th. Then there's the economic situation. The government has been paying a lot of money to families, not only for their immediate needs regarding living elsewhere and so on, but there's a lot of compensation going on. And some people even say that too much money has been spent on that. And I think there could be a situation in which, not immediately, the government doesn't want to fight with the public for political reasons as well. But I think in a few months' time, they will probably cut allowances or cut compensation for families that don't come back. The same has happened with places like Sderot, a little further away from the Gaza border, in which people were forced economically to return a few months back. So there will be, I think these two issues are the main ones. And yet, the army would need to be on its best performance in order to persuade people. And also, I think that not everybody would come back. 60,000 people were evacuated. I would assume that somewhere between a half and a third of these people would not return either immediately or perhaps ever under these circumstances. If you compare, again, I'm generalizing, but if you compare the border communities in the north and in the south was much stronger and went through much worse during the years that led to 2023. And there's more of a sense of unity even after the tragedy there. In the north, a lot of people are fed up with the situation. A lot of people are angry with the government and the state, and many are getting used to lives in places like Haifa or Tel Aviv and thinking of moving themselves there. Of course, this is an enormous problem for the whole Zionist concept, because the whole notion for years and years was that the border is decided by the communities being built there, by the furthermost moshavim and kibbutzim, small villages that define the country's borders. And this is a very challenging era or development to that notion. So we'll have to see how it works out. One of the worries we have is that this government underperformed both in the north and the south regarding help for civilians and for people who were uprooted for their homes, that the government hasn't performed well in these issues for quite some time. So we'll need a very urgent improvement in order for people to be persuaded that the government is actually there for them and that the state would support them and help them.
One very quick, short question that I get asked a lot is, do you think technology is going to make a difference? That with the Iron Beam, coming online of laser technology that, it's clear Iron Dome and all these other forms of missile defense were not helpful against, the drones, the UAVs, that having that come online, which we hear could be in 2025, I don't know if that's accurate, that will also create a layer of protection that didn't exist, or do you think that that's not really significant?
It's significant. I'm not sure it's a game changer. But I think if October 7th has taught us something, is not to rely too much on technology. If we look back at the IDF's systems, especially intelligence gathering systems, then too much was focused on technology while not enough resources was spent on actual intelligent analysis of what was going on the other side. So there will be an improvement. And we now know in retrospect that one of the reasons Hamas decided to act in 23 was that they feared Iron Beam would become operational within a year or two, and they said we need to act first. It will improve Israel's situation, but it's not a game changer. It wouldn't change everything. Gradually, Israeli defense, which is very good to begin with, air defense, would become better and will have more and more layers, but it's never a complete victory. You cannot win this by only defending yourself. It doesn't work that way.
Amos Harel, I want to thank you so much. I know things have been very busy for you these days, and I want to thank you very much for taking the time and joining us today on Decision Points.
My pleasure, David. Thanks for inviting me.
The current ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah represents a potentially pivotal moment in the region's complex dynamics. The hope is that the ceasefire will be effective and that it will save lives on all sides, and it will restore a modicum of stability that has been missing since October 7th of last year. There's a hope that the ceasefire could also restore Lebanon's sovereignty at the expense of the Hezbollah terror group. Until now, Hezbollah fires the shots and therefore calls the shots. Prime Minister Netanyahu has framed this move of a ceasefire as a strategic pause, allowing Israel time to regroup and strengthen its deterrence. However, there's significant resistance within his political base, particularly from local mayors in the north who view the ceasefire as a betrayal of the promises made to ensure their safety. Strikingly, Netanyahu and Israel's defense establishment seem to have reached the same conclusion for different reasons, both acknowledging the value of the ceasefire despite its potential vulnerabilities. At the same time, the timing of the ceasefire, coming after Hezbollah's heavy losses, signals a shift in the calculus of both Iran and Hezbollah. Iran's implicit approval of this ceasefire makes clear that its strategy extends beyond the Hezbollah front. But as we have seen, the ceasefire is far from a simple resolution. It represents a delicate balance between securing short-term tactical advantages and ensuring long-term security, particularly for those living in northern Israel. Restoring a sense of security to northern communities is central to returning residents to their homes, and this may require a more significant IDF deployment along the border. While the failures of the surprise 2006 conflict loom large, it appears that the IDF was far better prepared in 2024, and the result is that Hezbollah, whose leadership has been decimated and which lost much of its potent arsenal, has been set back considerably. The hope is that CENTCOM can offer assurances that the U.S.-led panel will be a serious mechanism for enforcing the terms of the ceasefire, adjudicating violations, and maintaining stability. So, does this moment signal a new phase in Israel's approach to regional security? It remains to be seen whether this decoupling from the war in Gaza indeed comes about as planned. And if so, could a ceasefire in the north lead to the release of the hostages and an end to the Hamas war on the southern front? As the situation continues to unfold, the coming weeks and months will reveal whether this ceasefire is truly a new chapter or is merely just a temporary respite. Thank you to all of our listeners from all over the world for joining us for another episode of Decision Points. Thank you to my dedicated team of research assistants at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I want to thank Rena Gaber, Simone Seidmayer, Sydney Hilbush, and Gabriel Epstein. I also want to thank Rob, Hadia, and the production team at Podville Media, and listeners like yourselves for making this podcast possible. Please leave us a 5-star review so we can continue to grow this community. Subscribe to Decision Points on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're on WhatsApp, X, or a variety of social media platforms, I invite you to share this show with your friends. To our listeners from all over the world, thank you for listening to this season of Decision Points.